Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I hope you're all doing well and you had a good week with your family, your loved ones. I want to talk with you for a second about the very beginning of this week's parashat Vayikra, the very first Torah reading that opens the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. One of the most famous, interesting details of safrut, of ritual scribal art, as it pertains to Sifrei Torah, Torah scrolls, tefillin, and mezuzot, is found in this week's Torah reading at the end of the very first word of the very first verse. The word Vayikra, which means "and God called," as in the first verse when God calls to Moses out of the tent of meeting and has more instructions for him, ends, the last letter of the word is a very small aleph, written much smaller than the rest of the word. And the rabbis, of course, ask why. What is the Torah, what is our tradition trying to teach by having this tradition for us that our scribes, our sofrim, have continued for hundreds and hundreds of years of having a small aleph at the end of the word Vayikra, which means "and God called." So I'm going to give you one traditional answer from a very old midrash and another answer from the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, both of which I think speak to a beautiful idea about humanity. The first idea is very old and is found in traditional midrashim, and it goes like this. When God was dictating the Torah to Moses, Moses was writing it down, and he got to this point in the Torah, and God said, Vayikra, which means "and God called," and Moses felt uneasy about that. He didn't want anyone to think that Moses was important enough for God to go out and meet or to make a special effort to speak with, which is what the word Vayikra implies. So instead, Moses wrote Vayikra with a very small aleph so that people might think the word is Vayikar, which means instead of "and God called," it means instead "and God happened upon Moses." For Moses, who was a very humble person, this was a beautiful idea. He liked the idea that God just happened upon him. He did not like the idea that God planned to see him, because how could Moses be that important? Who was Moses to have God visit him in such a planned, purposeful way? This midrash is supposed to teach us about Moses' humility, supposed to teach us about the power of God's presence, and how any one of us would be thrilled to have God present for us. But we're supposed to follow the lesson of Moses, who sees, instead of a moment for himself to shine, just wants to reflect back on God, does not want there to be too much attention paid to Moses himself. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks presents another beautiful idea, building on this notion of the small aleph. He says aleph is not only small here at the end of the first word of the book of Vayikra. That's not the only important moment for this one letter aleph. Aleph is also the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph is also the first letter in the Ten Commandments. Anochi, I am the Lord your God. Aleph, for Rabbi Sacks, can represent God's presence itself. So what does that teach us, that this aleph is very small? Maybe it teaches us, Rabbi Sacks teaches, that the small aleph represents God's presence in small ways. Not that God's presence is ever small or insignificant, but meaning we should not expect God's presence to only appear in big, miracle-laden ways, the splitting of the sea so that the Israelites could walk through on their way to freedom, receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, or other such manner of miracles. Perhaps God's presence is felt throughout our day, throughout our lives. Each and every moment, we have the opportunity to experience God's presence if we are attuned to it, if we are open to it, if we see it for what it really is. The difference between the word Vayikra and Vayikar is one letter aleph, that's it. But the difference is the difference between seeing God and understanding being in God's presence and understanding that everything is happenstance. The aleph is present in the Torah, in the word Vayikra, and it is small. perhaps to make sure that we notice those ways that God is present in our lives all of the time. But we have to stop and reflect and take note of it, or else it might pass us by, and then it will become just happenstance, because we will have missed what was staring us right in the face. Shabbat Shalom.